Well, hello there, everyone. You've tuned in uxwbill on this very blustery day, which you might just barely be able to hear, especially if you're wearing headphones and are willing to listen carefully. Today, during the course of this video, we're going to take a look at some things that have been sitting on my to-review pile for a very long time, and that would be these two power inverters that you're looking at right now, or at least their boxes. I bought these a while ago with my own money, so this will be a completely honest review. These were not provided free of charge or in exchange for a review or anything along those lines. So let's go ahead and take a look at these. Now, these are two particularly cheap power inverters that normally wouldn't even be worth talking about, but these were sold under the claim that they're true sine wave inverters. We're going to get a little bit technical here, but thankfully not too much. First of all, I'm sure there are some of you in the viewing audience who may never have heard the term power inverter before, and that can mean a lot of different things, but in this case what it means is a device that takes the 12-volt DC electrical power from your automobile or a battery or similar sources like that and steps it up to the 120 volts or so alternating current that you would find in your home, at least here in North America. They do make versions of these devices that operate from different battery voltages, as you'll soon see, and there are also versions that exist for those of you who live in 220 to 240 volt countries as well, with 50 cycle per second power typically. Anyway, true sine wave versus modified sine wave. Most of the power inverters that you buy on the market today are what you'd call the modified sine wave type. And that's kind of a marketing term. What a modified sine wave really is, if you were to look at it, it would be a waveform. It's a square wave. Basically, the waveform goes up, takes a square shape, comes down, and then as it hits the zero crossing point, or the zero level, it flatlines for a while. It stays still. It doesn't do anything. And then it goes back the other way as an alternating current waveform would. Now, many devices are perfectly fine running from power that looks like this, but it's a very nasty waveform, and if you've ever tried to run a device with an induction-style motor in it or a power transformer that operates at line frequency, you may have heard those devices make some very discomforting sounds. Sometimes they'll labor and not come up to speed. Sometimes they'll even get too hot and be on the verge of burning out, and some of them have absolutely no sense of humor whatsoever about this. Contrast this to the power that should be coming to your home over the power line, which is delivered in a smooth sine wave. You can look up examples of these waveforms. Maybe I'll stick some in the video at this point if you're curious what they look like. We'll also get to see them a little bit later when I haul out the scope meter and find out whether or not these inverters are actually of the true sine wave type. And there's reason to be suspicious about that, because a lot of inverters that you find for sale on sites like eBay, AliExpress, Banggood, they make the claim that they're true sine wave, but when you look in the fine print, you see that they're modified sine wave inverters. So it's something you really have to keep your guard up, or you'll be caught out and you'll end up with an inverter that's not of the type you desired. So you buy a true sine wave inverter because you have devices that are sensitive to the incoming power waveform and you want to feed them as clean of an alternating current source as you possibly can. Better computer uninterruptible power supplies also typically have true sine wave inverters in them. So let's start by taking a look at the smallest one first. This is, I believe, a 300 watt model. They have specifications here on the box, but as you'll soon see, you can't put a tremendous amount of faith in what those have to say, because who knows whether or not the person at the factory who was marking these little dots all day long actually bothered to get it right. But in this case, they did. This is a 300 watt model, outputs AC 110 volts, runs from a DC 12 volt source. Here's the front of the box with some features on it. Let's take a look at those, because I think there might be some hilarity going on here. First of all, it says DC to AC, and then in a troubling statement it also says modified sine wave. But you can be sure, I checked these inverters when I bought them, and they do output a true sine wave. It's nice to see that it all auto-protects, claims to be safe and reliable, volume is small, quality light, high efficiency, does not have the pollution, exempts the maintenance, and is the easy to operate. Well, I don't know about you, but I think there's something in there for all of us. So let's take this thing open and just see what it looks like. And it's kind of small. Now, all joking around aside, this is intended to be a serious review, because years ago there was a guy on YouTube by the name of NeuralGnar24. I don't know whatever happened to him, but he did some absolutely amazing inverter reviews and repairs. But he hasn't uploaded a video in a little over a year now, maybe more than a year. It's been a while since I've been to his channel. So what we have right here is what you'd expect. There's a single power outlet. Interestingly, it's of this universal 120, 220 volt worldwide style. I don't know why they did that on a 110 volt inverter, other than it was probably cheaper just to build them all the same way, even if the internal circuitry differs a little bit. It has an aluminum casing to which it looks like some power devices within might well be mounted. There are 2 screws on this side, 1 screw on that side. I'm not sure I'm actually going to tempt fate by taking this apart, because as inexpensive as these happen to be, I could believe that they were put together at the factory and they intended to stay that way. On the back, there's a fan, simple 12 volt DC, probably sleeve bearing, gets to grumbling and sounding like a lawnmower in about 6 or 7 months' time if you use this thing at all regularly. I'm also a little troubled to see that there's no sort of screen or protective grill over this fan, because something small and conductive could fall in there, and these sorts of power circuits have absolutely no sense of humor whatsoever about being mistreated. But these post-style connections look to be of pretty good quality. I certainly think they're adequate for anything this inverter happens to be rated to do. And yes, this is the internationally unrenowned Doxin brand. That really moves. Where I'm from, Doxin, or doxing more correctly, has a very different meaning, but you don't have to look too far. Websites like English.com and such will readily affirm that a lot of the times English is simply seen as a marketing tool in countries where it's not the native language, especially those in the Pacific Rim. So that's the smaller of the two. Here's what you get in the box. There are some instructions which are almost entirely in Chinese. Some of the tables do have English printing in them, and there are some instructions in here that are English. I haven't read these, so I don't know how good the quality is, but I'd imagine it's similar to the printing on the box. You get a nice little set of clip leads that let you hook up directly to a battery. Again, I think these are adequate for anything that this inverter can safely power. Maybe a little bit on the light side, but certainly not bad. There's also a cigarette lighter plug, and you have to bear in mind when you use this that the wiring inside almost any automobile that you're likely to find, as well as the cigarette lighter itself, is not really rated for more than about 150 watts worth of power draw. So limit yourself accordingly when you use this, and if you're going to load the inverter to its fullest capacity, make sure that you go directly to the battery. Otherwise, you may blow a fuse, start a fire behind your dashboard in your car, or have some similarly entertaining thing happen. I also bought a larger example of this inverter. This is a 200 watt larger model, that is to say, has a 500 watt rated output. We'll see whether or not it actually manages that. It is quite a bit more substantial, but not really a whole lot heavier. There is just the one outlet on it again. This one also comes with a USB port. Presumably you can use that to charge all your USB devices, although with something this cheap, it may be a safe bet to say that probably has 120 volts on it as well. This one actually makes the claim that it is a pure sine wave inverter. And again, I have tested it. It is. It'll be interesting to see how the waveform behaves when it's under any kind of a load, especially a highly inductive load. There's your 500 watt indication. Again, Doxin, that really moves. I don't know where it's going, but it's really moving apparently. They call this out again as a 110 volt model, and if you buy something like this, it would definitely behoove you to check before you go plugging any of your valuable appliances into it. This one comes with a bigger owner's guide. I guess that's because it has more power, and it's actually in English. I did read this manual, and this one is pretty well written, which makes me wonder if these inverters actually came down the same line or if they just happen to have the same brand on them. And you'll notice earlier I mentioned that one should definitely not put too much faith in the specs here, because they do call this out as being the 220 volt AC model, but the actual inverter says differently. And again, I have tested it. It is a 110, 120 volt model. You do get a nicer set of clip leads with this one. You go directly to your battery. Again, you'll need these if you want to use the inverter at anything like its nominal rated capacity. There's cigarette lighter, the same precautions apply. Do not overdo it with this. It'd be very easy to do, especially since this is not in any way fused. And then there's the rest of the box, which I'm sure some of you are just dying with curiosity to take a look at, see if there's anything else particularly entertaining on here. No, there isn't. Just some technical parameters for the various models that they produce. I don't know how many of these actually exist, how many of them you can actually buy. And then there are some pictures on the front flap of the box here, and most of these are pretty sensible. They're pretty reasonable. You could certainly use either one of these inverters to run a television set, a stereo system, certainly some power tools, a personal computer. But what's up with these windmills? I suppose maybe if you own property that has windmills like these on it, maybe you don't have utility power out there. Maybe that's what they were trying to say. There's a solar panel right there, and then there's a picture of a Jeep over here. And again, you could certainly use this in your car with pretty good results, as long as you make sure to use it appropriately, depending upon how much power you need it to supply. So with that overview having taken place, why don't we go ahead and put these inverters through their paces and just see what they can or can't do. So here's an example of your typical inexpensive modified sine wave inverter in operation. I've got it hooked up to a scope meter so you can see the shape of the waveform. We'll move the camera to take a closer look at that. And this is what is called a modified sine wave. And even if you're not tremendously familiar with these things, you can see the square nature of the wave on its upward going peaks and on its downward going peaks. And in the middle, between those two, just before it transitions and goes back the other way, you can see there's a brief drop to zero amplitude in either direction. If you can see the frequency display on this thing, ignore it. It doesn't do the best job in the world with displaying the frequency accurately on certain types of waveforms. Next up, I'll hook up one of the Doxin true sine wave inverters. There's the 300 watt Doxin inverter hooked up. And here is what its output waveform looks like. And as you can see, it is a nice, clean, smooth sine wave, just as was advertised. Of course, that's without any load on it. That's the easiest possible circumstance that there could be. So let's see what happens to it when we start loading it up. We'll begin our functional tests with the easiest possible load that there is for any sort of inverter or power source to drive, and that is the simple, straightforward, resistive load as presented by this General Electric 3-way 50, 100, or 150 watt light bulb. I've gone ahead and installed it over here. I don't know that these have actually gotten around to being made illegal yet, but I suspect the time is not far away, as the area Dollar General store was clearancing these out. And since they're handy to have as current limiting devices for equipment under test in unknown condition, or as dummy loads for uninterruptible power supplies, I bought every one of them that they had. They're also handy for characterizing the performance of inverters, which we're about to do. I've got the scope meter hooked up over here. Since I don't know how accurate its readings are, I went ahead and got out another multimeter and hooked it up. And the good news is it looks like they are certainly acceptably close to one another. So we'll go ahead and turn on our light on the 50 watt setting. And interestingly, it looks like the inverter's regulation responded by boosting up the output voltage slightly. It's still well within tolerance, but it's a little higher than I'd like to see it, especially if I were going to plug a particularly voltage-sensitive piece of equipment into this inverter. So far, the cooling fan on the inverter has not started to run. I don't know if it's thermally operated or if it runs based on the loads sensed by the inverter circuitry, or if it engages in a combination of those behaviors. But our output waveform still looks good, so let's click things up to the 100 watt setting now. Our output voltage actually dropped a little bit there. The cooling fan is not yet running. I don't know if this inverter can actually manage its claimed sustained output figure, or if it will overheat. I am a little surprised that at 50% load the fan has not started to run, or very close to. We're not quite to 50% yet. So let's go up and take it to 150 watts now. Our output voltage has declined. We're at 118.7, 118.9. I'll call it 119 volts AC. But our output waveform still looks pretty good. And our fan is now running. It's not running very quickly, but it is running. So the next test will be letting the inverter sit here and operate in its normal fashion with 150 watts worth of load on it, just to see if it can handle that steadily and safely without overheating or failing. If it passes that test, we'll move on to some more difficult to drive loads. It does appear that I am definitely exceeding the capability of my solar panels to keep up, but that doesn't surprise me. They're only rated for 100 watts in the best of circumstances, and right now they're sitting in the shade, so we're definitely not getting that. I went ahead and I moved my solar panels a little further out so that they were back in the sun again, and for all the trouble I went to, I gained about 1/10 of a volt according to the charge controller, which is pretty accurate. I'd say we're not so much charging the batteries at this point as just breaking even. So here things are right around a half an hour later. The light bulb test passed without any incident, no runs, no drips, no smoke or explosions. You really can't see it, at least it doesn't look like you can see it according to the camcorder's viewfinder, but the inverter is still outputting. So I've decided to step the game up a little bit with this electric desk fan from Westinghouse. Some of you will probably remember when this featured in a video many years ago. I still have it all of these years later and it still works great, and although I really don't want to take a chance with it, after the results of the light bulb test, I think we'll probably be okay to try this out for a short period of time, and especially from an inverter with a true sine wave output characteristic. I don't know exactly how much electrical power this fan consumes, but I have hooked up some measurement equipment so that we can find out. Let's go ahead and turn it on, and while we turn it on, we'll turn our attention to the display on the scope meter so we can see if the output waveform from the inverter does anything truly alarming. Tell you what, nothing but the finest for tripods around here. This dollar store piece of garbage. So let's go ahead and turn this on. Waveform changed shape a little bit. The voltage also went up. We're pulling 54 watts right now, according to my measurement equipment. And as I'm sure you can hear, that fan is running beautifully. Headphone users beware. The fan on the inverter is not presently running, but then again I wouldn't expect it to be. And this is a little tougher of a load to drive just because it's highly inductive in nature. That is to say, the voltage and the current, they can become out of phase with one another. So we'll drop our speed down here. There's an auto transformer in the base of the fan, or perhaps some sort of wire wound resistor, but I think it's actually an auto transformer because it only gets mildly warm as opposed to burning hot. I don't think there's a curtain burner in there or anything. But the fan is running absolutely beautifully. There it is on its lowest speed. It's barely even audible. Why can't you buy a wonderful fan like that today? I don't know. There are certainly still decent companies out there that could make the motors. And I think the market would definitely respond positively to that if someone actually tried it. So I'll let this run for a couple more minutes, and then we'll try an even bigger test, a bigger fan. And then we'll see how it behaves in the face of what will probably be an overload situation. So that little Westinghouse table fan ran beautifully for the several minutes I let it sit here and operate. Now we're going to raise the stakes considerably. This big old Eskimo 2-speed box fan from McGraw-Edison definitely has a tremendous amount of inrush current as it starts up. And I think that when it's running on high speed, steady state, that its power draw is somewhere right around the 300 watt mark. So we will definitely be testing what this inverter is truly capable of. I do not expect it will pass this test, but I am curious exactly how it will fail. Will it try to soft start the load? Will it simply shut down and complain of an overload? or will it burn out in some truly dramatic manner? And while it's doing any of those three possible things, what will the output waveform get to looking like? Stay tuned because we're going to find out. So here's the scope meter display for all of you in the viewing audience to look at, and hopefully the camcorder's microphone will pick up whatever happens as I attempt to start the fan. We will start with the high speed, and I expect that the output waveform will become very distorted if the inverter even tries to pull this off. So here we go. Ooh, that's nasty. But it's trying. Hasn't burned up yet. But boy, does that output waveform look shaky. Alright, let's go to our low speed. Said we were pulling around 174 watts. Even on the low speed, that output waveform looks absolutely terrible. So let's go ahead and shut that off. It had dropped to a power consumption of 110 watts. It definitely did not pass that test. And I can't say as I'm enormously surprised. I do think that this serves to shed some doubt on the claimed 300 watt output figure of this smaller inverter. But at least it survived the experience, and it doesn't seem to have killed the fan, which is a good thing, because I don't want to kill any of my vintage box fans. I've now gone ahead and switched things over to the larger 500 watt rated inverter. Since I am fairly confident that it will pass all the tests of the smaller stuff like the light bulb and the desk fan, we're going to skip over those and head right for the big old box fan. I may come back and cover them a little bit later, since brevity is a concept that I'm completely unfamiliar with. But we're ready to go, so let's give this a try. Go ahead and turn the box fan on here. This inverter is definitely having a better time of it. We're at 217 watts with a surge of about 290. The waveform is staying clean. Seems that it's not having a problem with this at all. The cooling fan on the inverter is just barely running at this load level. I'm sure that if we switch to the low speed, that will not cause a problem either. Our wattage reading has now dropped to 119, and the output waveform is still in pretty good shape. So we'll turn the fan off. And it just occurred to me that we could try the lamp and the fan at the same time and see if the inverter can handle that. Here once again is the scope meter's display, and to the right of that you can see the glow from the lamp, which I have plugged in, and we'll just make sure that it's on the highest possible wattage setting, which it is. I don't have the kilowatt meter plugged in anymore, but that doesn't really matter because I know approximately how much power the fan consumes, especially when it's starting up. It will be interesting and informative to see how the brightness of the light bulb changes as the fan starts. The same with the output waveform. We'll see if this inverter really knows how to behave itself, and this will get near to its peak load capability, at least while that motor is starting up. Of course, the switch in the fan's not too good. It's not doing too well now. I just dropped down to the fan's low speed, and you can see that the situation definitely recovered. So here again, I don't think the larger of the two inverters really meets its specification, and I think my batteries should be fully charged enough to meet its demands. It's possible that the supply wiring to the inverter is also letting it down, but I don't think so. I think for no more than these inverters are specified to provide, that the wiring they came with is entirely sufficient in both cases. So it looks to me like they do fall short of their output rating, but it does appear that they are robust. It also appears that they do have an honestly specified true sine wave output, even if it gets a little creative while they're under particularly heavy strain. And it looks to me like they might well be worth the money. Neither one of them was very expensive. I think the smaller of the two ran me around $40, and the larger of the two might have cost me $60, which is certainly not a lot to pay for an inverter that claims a true sine wave output characteristic. So it is that this review has gone on for quite a while now, and I figure many of you are probably itching for me to get this all wrapped up, which I hope to do very soon. But before we close things out, I thought it would be most interesting to take a look at the insides of at least one of these two Doxin inverters. This is actually the smaller of the two because the big one has gone off to points unknown. I actually think it's in my truck under the seat, but that's way beside the point. Right away, I can tell you that while the construction quality of these things is not perfect, it is far, far better than any other inverter that I have ever been inside before, where you can oftentimes tell that they've been assembled completely by hand by people who weren't being paid anything like enough money to actually care. The circuit boards inside these look to be very well made. You can see that there's a space for an alarm beeper, a piezoelectric squeaker can down there that they left unpopulated. I'm not sure why they did that other than perhaps for reasons of cost. But as I said previously, the circuit board appears to be of pretty good quality. Now, one thing that's not so great, all of the electrolytic capacitors in this are off brands. And while they do on their casings make mention somewhere of being low ESR types, I doubt that's grounded in any form of truth. I don't know if I can get to a point where you could actually see that. But trust me, that is what they say. These two daughter cards in here are also fairly well assembled, but it looks like when something was going down the line to be put together that they didn't manage to get it inserted quite evenly, the way that they were supposed to. Still, it seems to be quite securely connected, but it does suggest that the quality control on these is certainly not perfect. Nor are these inverters perfect for that matter. They really don't have any surge capacity to speak of, but they don't seem to blow up when abused and overloaded, at least not to a limited extent. And they are, without abusing the term too badly, definitely a true sine wave inverter. So if you have an application for which these are not going to be pushed particularly hard, and that application demands a true sine wave inverter at a fairly gentle price, these are pretty much the option that you have in terms of smaller capacity models. So in that sense, I would certainly recommend them under that specific set of conditions. As always, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch, and I am certainly interested in hearing your constructive commentary.